You know, there's a lot going on in our lives. A lot of it informs our distress, some of it informs our joy. I'd like to focus on some of the things that inform our depressions, our anxieties, etc. So sit down, make yourself comfortable, and let's chat for a minute on yet another episode of Perspectives on Life with old Dr. D. One of the things that is informing our lives, our stress, etc., is the ways in which we locate suffering inside of ourselves. Now, on the one hand, this is perfectly normal, it's sensible, and we can just reference our own intuitions, and it becomes obvious to us insofar as we trust intuition that you get up in the middle of the night, for example, and you stub your toe as you're going to pee. All of your attention moves from your bladder to your hurting toe, and that's the way pain yells at us, demands our attention. This is perfectly understandable. It's perfectly natural. I would argue adaptive and important. And so we get up, we stub our toe, that source of pain then informs our suffering. And it's important for us to be able to understand and locate the source of that particular pain. When we suffer things like a hard conversation with an employer or a fight with a friend or lover, where that pain exists in terms of our understanding is inside of us, right? Our broken hearts, our feeling of distress and despair, it exists inside of us. And so we pay attention inside of us because that's where the feeling is. So one of the things that we'll talk about in this series of episodes is the ways in which suffering is both felt by us as well as a relational event with our world. One of my concerns, and this has been a concern for some time as I'm chatting with friends and family and clients, is that many of them locate suffering inside of themselves as though they are then wrong. There's something inside of them that is broken or miswired or something like that. And that's not necessarily the case. What happens when we live in a stressful world? Why are we the ones going in for treatment when it is the world itself that is sick and broken? So I'd like to talk about some of the ways in which our world is sick and the ways in which we take up suffering and locate it inside of ourselves, even though it's not necessarily anything broken or wrong with us that informs our stress and difficulties. It's stress and difficulties with the world, that it is the world that originates our suffering, even though we are the ones that feel it. So some signs and symptoms of where I'm coming from. Rates of mental illness have steadily increased, and especially amongst teenagers. So teenagers, young adults, and then even up to us middle-aged folks, it's been increasing somewhat. Now amongst the elderly, they've remained pretty steady. So people who are above 60, 65, their rates of diagnosable anxiety, depression, etc., have remained pretty stable. But since 2018, I'm assured that these rates of mental illness have gone up even more. That as we look at this particular graph, that it cuts off at 18, we notice there's an upward trend for boys and girls, but particularly girls. And the trend has gone upwards for both. Now, when we look across generations, from teenagers to young adults to even middle-aged adults, there are themes about what informs the stress. Now, for young adults up to us middle-aged adults, there are two things that inform our stress, and that's, well, financial distress, as well as isolation and loneliness are two of the bigger predictors of suffering. There's a bunch, but those are two of the big ones. And then amongst teens who are not yet financially independent, then it is isolation and loneliness. So if you're older than a teenager, it's financial distress, isolation, and loneliness. And then if it is if we're talking to an adult or a middle-aged adult, then it's likely financial stress on top of that. So we live in different times with inflation, catastrophically rising rates of housing prices. Things aren't the way they used to be. Some years ago, I was confronted by one of my daughters. And by the way, I mean that in the loving relational sense, not that in any way she was disrespectful, quite the contrary. I raised my children to be independent, where learn to work hard and save money and go out into the world and launch, right? You're 18, launch. And so I would teach my children that when you're graduated from high school at the age of 18, I expect you to be out in the world and I expect you to be self-sufficient. And shortly before this daughter of mine graduated from high school, I came in one day and she met with my wife and I, and she said, okay, let's break things down. She was very professional about it. It was lovely. And she said, okay, Dad, when you were my age, how much were you making? And I said, well, when I worked for the bookstore, I made 5 something an hour. Then when I worked as, in other jobs, like including being an electrical contractor assistant, then I made $10 an hour. She's like, okay, great. How much was rent? And I said, okay, well, rent's, $200 a month for us in our first apartment. And she goes, okay, let's look at the data, because right now wages have not gone up. I would make about $10 an hour if I were to go out and get a job right now. And rent is now $1,500 a month. I live in a very different world than you did. You raised me to launch into the world that you knew, and that is where you could work, go to school, at least pay rent. You couldn't pay for both school and rent. You might need help with student loans, etc. sometimes, but she taught us that I would need to exclusively rely, if I were on my own for tuition, I would need to exclusively rely on student loans. And if I worked full time, I couldn't even afford rent. And she showed us the data, she broke it down for us, and it shook me because sure enough, I raised my children to be independent in the world that I knew when I was their age, and the world has changed. So even as a teenager, she was already facing that financial distress that she hadn't even launched yet, and she was already facing that financial distress, that the world out there is not the world that I raised them to inhabit. And so it has been interesting and meaningful and lovely as I'm trying to help my children navigate a very different world than the one I knew. Like, as parents, when we raise people, we raise them according to what we understand, according to the habits of what we are used to. And that's what my sweetheart and I did. And we misraised our children into a world that we don't understand and are barely coping with ourselves. So even for teens sometimes, it's financial distress. The other big theme is isolation and loneliness, and that's where I'm going to turn my attention. I don't have expertise in economics. That's not my background. I'm not a financial consultant. I can balance a checkbook okay. I don't understand investments and mortgage rates and things like that. We'd need my sweetheart on for a special episode if she talks a little bit about those things. But for now, let's talk about the theme of isolation and loneliness. So when we talk about the effects of isolation and loneliness, one of the things we look at are deaths of despair. So deaths of despair are the deaths associated with somebody's emotional suffering, where their emotional suffering plays a large role in their demise. So when you think of suicide rates, alcohol-related rates, drug overdose rates, as well as just failure to thrive, people giving up on life, that all of those things combined contribute to the deaths of despair. So there was a joint economic committee because people are dying at sufficiently high rates that it is affecting the economy in certain sectors. And so therefore there's a special congressional committee that was formed to talk about this. And so here's this particular graph on it. So deaths of despair per 100,000 people as of 2020. And again, my colleagues who are expert in this assure me that these numbers have just gone up. So the data here indicates that it affects all genders. But one of the things that when I was asking my colleagues about this, they say that it's rising amongst both men and women, and yet it's disproportionately affecting men, especially middle-aged cisgendered Caucasian men, that my particular demographic is at some of the highest risk of experiencing a death of despair. So again, drug overdose, alcohol-related death, suicide, failure to thrive, etc. People giving up on life in various ways. According to the Harvard Medical School, I was just poking around their website a month ago, and it indicates, well, the experts there indicate that the life expectancy difference between men and women is exceeded 6 years, and it's almost 8. That the gap is widening, that men are dying significantly younger than women, and it went from a little bit younger than women to increasingly more. The first hypothesis about that, interestingly enough, was that it's because men in my demographic, cisgendered Caucasian middle-aged men, were disproportionately likely to be COVID deniers and refuse to wear a mask or vaccinate, etc. And so they saw this increasing spike through COVID around those particular things. I thought, okay, this is just a COVID problem. These men are dying from COVID. Well, the crisis of COVID has not completely remitted as of when I'm speaking to you, which is in December of 2023. However, the rates of death of COVID have gone down substantially across all demographics. However, men's deaths of despair are continuing to increase, according to my colleagues who are experts in this area. So it wasn't COVID, or it wasn't just COVID, would be a more accurate way to put that, that there is something about being a man and an increased rate of death of despair. There is something about being an adult person generally, both man or woman, and increased deaths of despair. Again, it just disproportionately affects men. Hopefully I'll remember soon, and hopefully I'll ask for help remembering to do a unit on men and masculinity, healthy men and healthy masculinity, and all of the issues that affect men that increase these various rates of death. So the other is financial distress. So as you can see in this particular graph, this one comes from the real estate analysis of the U.S. Census Bureau. And so thank you, CNBC, for providing this data. I showed this graph to a colleague of mine who was more expert in economics than I am, and he said this graph is actually inaccurate and that there's problems because one is normalized data in terms of median household income, one is non-normalized data in terms of home values, in terms of actually controlling for inflation between 1970 and 2020. And I was like, oh, okay, so is the gap lower or wider? And he shook back and he says, no, it's wider. Like the issue is bigger than what you're showing on this particular graph. He doesn't have time or interest in creating a new graph for me. However, understand that the issue is actually more acute than what these particular experts are showing you in this particular graph. So wage stagnation, and especially effective wage stagnation when we control for inflation, is a real problem. So my sweetheart and I bought our home 15 years ago for $170,000. And now we're being told the home is worth like $560,000. Now, you think that would be a source of celebration and good news. Oh my gosh, I just made $400,000 in profit. Well, the city where we're living right now, there was a proposal to build a road from a hospital in a town just south of us to a town that shares our eastern border. And that 5-lane road was going to go right through the middle of our house. And so because of eminent domain, et cetera, they were talking about buying our house at current market value. And I was like, okay, well, I don't want to move. I really like my home. We've been there for a long time, raised our kids here. And I looked at fair market value and I'm like, okay, that, I checked on Zillow and the things that an amateur like me knows to check with, and it was coherent. They were about the same prices from the various sites and sources that I checked. And then I went to look at what sort of home I could buy for the amount of money that they were willing to offer me based on the age and size and location of my home. We couldn't find a home for that price for more than less than half of the size of the home we're currently in. So we would lose about 60% of the square footage that we were used to for the same price because of the greatly increased cost, especially of new homes. So my wages haven't increased by that much. My wages haven't gone up by 300%. My wages have gone up 60% in 15 years. That there's a gross increase in cost of living compared to how much money we make. That gap, as a psychologist, that gap is filled with stress. Like when I look at this, I go, oh no, there's the kind of compensation that means people are going to have to work harder and longer hours. And rather than get into a job and get really good at it and get stable, they're going to need to move from job to job to job. Whatever job will give them a raise. And some people really enjoy that. Many people find moving from job to job to job very stressful. So what I see is a decrease in human health when I see these increases between standard of living and increased costs of living. So, it's stagnant wages and increased cost of living. Thank you. Oh boy. The other thing is, purchasing a home was entry to the middle class. Growing up, we were quite poor. There was, for years, we lived in a one-room schoolhouse, an adobe. It was the oldest building in that particular town, and it was a one-room, oldest existing building. Thank you, in that little town we were raised in Utah, and like the room that I shared with many of my siblings. I have a lot of siblings, and what I shared with many of my siblings, it wasn't heated, it wasn't air conditioned, etc. And I can remember, for example, as a child, we would need to draw lots basically to who would use the ice pick to break up the ice in the toilet in one of the kind of lean-to attached rooms to this adobe structure that was added much later after the building was completed. And so, like, my parents scrimped and saved for years and inherited a small plot of land. And because of their scrimping and saving, were able to buy the materials for a home and have a construction contractor help them with a lot of it. And my parents did a lot of sweat labor on that. I can remember as a young teen going in and mudding and taping and painting and all of these other things, because that's the only way that they could afford it. But it was such a relief for my parents to finally have a home. That was their relief that they were out of poverty finally. That was a key for poverty, from the lower standard of living, socioeconomically speaking, into the middle class. That was their sense of security. And that's true for a lot of people. And now housing has been priced out of most people's reach. So saving for a home right now is now much more difficult than it was, especially with stagnated wages. So with those kind of stressors comes other stressors. If I'm trying to save up for a home, do I have time to go to therapy? Do I have time to hang out with somebody like old Dr. D and process through my problems? Do I have time and resources to go to the doctor? If I have health problems, do I just stay at home and just hope they go away on their own? And therefore, am I introducing more chronic and severe health problems because financial stress is so tight? Like, one of the things I'm not going to go into today is the greatly increased cost of health care, and how that informs a lot of these chronic issues, and how men are disproportionately likely. Don't get me wrong, men and women have sacrificed health care because of money, and men are disproportionately likely to do so for reasons we'll talk to one another about in another unit. And so, one financial distressor, housing costs, creates other financial distress, because when I'm not getting the health care I need, then those health care problems can escalate to a catastrophic level, and then I'm no longer able to afford housing, because now I have to spend it on emergency medical care. So financial distress, and there's years of data on this, informs mental health problems and physical health problems. So here's a graph, and this is the number of U.S. adults who received mental health treatment and counseling in the past year, and it cuts off in 2021. And there's a strong relationship between financial distress and struggles with mental health. And so, as you can see from this graph, the amount of pressure put on the mental health delivery services, so mental health hospitals, clinics, even private practices for therapists, there's increasing waiting lists, and it's harder and harder to find a therapist with openings. And that's in part because of the increased financial distress. So there's a lot going on. Here is something I would like you to endeavor with me to struggle with. There's a lot of our suffering that isn't us. It's not our fault. It's not our problem. Oftentimes we have a society and a culture that really helps us localize the suffering inside of ourselves, as though we are the problem and we're the broken one. I feel despairing myself sometimes when I see headlines and videos on websites with, like, what's going on with Gen Z? What's going on with Gen Z that they can't handle the world? What's going on with Gen Z that they're just not up to living in modern society, as though it is a particular generation's problem because they're unable to cope as effectively with certain problems as older generations. And as a psychologist, as a social scientist, I'm like, they have a whole different set of problems than their ancestors did. That they inherited a world that was very different than the world that their parents and grandparents were raised in. It's not that they're not up to the world, it's that nobody is up to the world. One of the reasons why those above 60, we see their mental health being relatively level, is because they have a significant preponderance of the wealth in the country. They have a great deal more security than those of younger generations. My generation, the invisible generation, Generation X, we don't have as much wealth as our parents did. And then millennials don't have as much as the baby boomers did. Like our parents, Gen Xers is the silent generation disproportionately. And then the baby boomers, right, had millennials. And so especially elder millennials. So we have this kind of dynamic going on where we have raised our children not to fit into the world that they inhabit, and then we blame them for not fitting into the world that we have modified, at least those of us who are older. And we don't take accountability for it, and instead we blame them. And when we blame them, they then take that up and go, yeah, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I have ADHD, I have all of these problems because I'm not hyperproductive, at least not hyperproductive in a way that our society needs for me to be profitable enough to buy a home to feel a little bit of security. So our entire system and structure of power is very much set up to localize the problem inside of you. And many of us buy into that, and many of us take that up and go, oh, I'm broken, there's something wrong with me. I'm not saying you don't suffer. I very much appreciate that you do. And I'm very sorry. And if you were here, we would talk about coping and compassion, and I would do what I can, but I'm not going to pretend that the world is okay. A lot of what I do is help people cope with a world that's not okay, and it's a world that's not their fault. That they inherited these issues, they inherited these systems, and they're stuck up within it and ground within it. And it's my job to talk about how can we survive as intact as we can within this unfair system. So, it's not you. You suffer it, but there's a lot of things in life that you didn't cause. You were thrown into a world not of your making. And I'm sorry it's left to you to cope with. So as I said a minute ago, I'm not an economics expert. I can't give you all financial advice. Trust me, I'm incompetent in that area. What I am competent in is human hearts and human relationships. And so here in our upcoming episode, let's talk about other things that inform our suffering, other things that are about our relationships that inform our rates of despair. So join me next time for another episode of Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D.